Hey guys, this is Ben, and today we're going to talk about the God of the Gaps question. The God of the Gaps question and this argument is an argument that is railed against people for believing in God. And essentially what they say is, how can you have scientific evidence for God? Because when you have quote-unquote scientific evidence for God, you don't really have it. You really just have something that science has yet to explain without God. So in other words, it's like this. It's in Newton's time, in Isaac Newton's time, he was able to explain in terms of physical material objects, or what we call naturalism. So just the physical world. He was able to explain the orbits of the planets. But the one thing he couldn't explain in terms of physical reality was why the orbits didn't slowly degrade over time and crash into the sun. So the planets orbit the sun, but why don't they eventually crash into the sun? And so what he said was, well, this must be, God must come in and, fix it. So God performs a miracle. So in other words, there was a lot of observable data, and the data most of it was able to be explained in terms of physical processes, or with a naturalistic explanation. He appealed to the natural, the world of nature. But there was a bit more, that there was a little piece of data, some more data that just he couldn't explain in terms of the natural. And so he appealed to the supernatural. It doesn't have to be God. I mean, but that's something supernatural, something beyond the physical. Something supernatural, is affecting things here. And so the issue with Isaac Newton and this thing about the planets was that eventually, over time, they came to we now have a natural explanation. And so you could take this example and apply it to other things. Like in the past, maybe people thought that they were sick because a demon possessed them, or they thought they believed in witchcraft, and voodoo, and now we have physical explanations for these things. They didn't know what germs were back then. And so this is the idea of the God of the Gaps fallacy. The God of the Gaps fallacy, or argument, is essentially saying basically what they're saying is you can never have scientific proof for God, because you're just using God to explain the gaps in our scientific knowledge. But history has proven that one day we will eventually increase our scientific knowledge, and then we'll be able to explain what we observe without, as people often say, punting to God. Use American football terminology. I guess if you're not American, that probably doesn't make any sense to you, but you probably catch on anyway. Now, what I want to point out in this video is numerous things. First of all, the God of the Gaps fallacy is not really a fallacy. When atheists make the God of the Gaps argument against Christians, what they're doing is a shifting of the burden of proof fallacy. That's what's going on. Because what they're saying really is, what if one day we come up with a new theory, a new hypothesis that explains what we see in terms of natural phenomenon? So what if we one day come up with a new naturalist hypothesis? And so then or naturalist theory. So in other words, like we have, a bunch of data, we're able to explain most of it with a natural theory, but then there's a little bit of data we can't explain with natural theories, so we say, well, then therefore the supernatural theory, God or something like God must explain this data. And then the atheists come back and say, that's a God of the Gaps. That's a supernaturalism of the gaps. Because what if one day we find some natural theory that explains this? The problem there is quite simple. I could say that about anything. This is the what if. I remember I had a friend when I was a little kid, and I would throw at him, what if this happens? What if that happens? He would say, well, what if I won't say what he said, but he didn't like me to just throw what ifs, because there's a million what ifs. We could throw infinity what if. So like I could tell you, you know, don't go vote when, you know, because I live in America and you can vote every November, the first Tuesday of the first full week in November. So it's like next week you can vote. You can always vote. I can tell you don't go vote because the magic penguins who live in the center of the earth will rise up and invade. And you say, well, Ben, can you provide any evidence that these magic penguins who live in the center of the earth will rise up and invade, or even that they exist at all, or anything about them? Can you? And I'll say, no, but it'll happen. So in other words, like, the burden of proof fallacy essentially is what people do when they shift the burden of proof away from them, the one making the claim, to the person who just is skeptical of the claim. So in other words, like, if you want to say that one day we'll have a naturalistic explanation for these observations, the burden of proof is on you to provide that. Until you provide that explanation, we are under no compulsion to believe that you ever will. Until you have evidence for X, there is no reason for you to believe in X. Until you have evidence for your thing, until you have evidence for the magical penguins in the center of the earth that are going to rise up in war because you vote on Tuesday, until you have evidence for that, there's no reason for anybody to believe in that. Does that make sense? It's the same thing. It's funny because atheists shift the gears, and when it comes to God, they say, well, you've got to provide evidence for God, and there's no reason for us to believe in God until you provide evidence for God. And they complain. They complain about Christians because Christians say, well, you can't disprove God, so I'm going to believe in him. You can't disprove God, so I'm going to believe in him. And atheists rightly complain because, like, that's ridiculous. I could tell you anything. I can make an infinite number of claims and say, well, you can't disprove it, so that means I'm right. That's ridiculous. So, if you want to say that one day you'll have a new naturalistic theory that will explain the observations, that's great. Go find it. Until you find it, there's no reason for anybody to believe that it exists. That's the burden of proof is on the person making the claim. So, currently, anything that science can explain is evidence for the supernatural until science advances and then explains it in terms of some other way. That's just how evidence works. Okay? So, I'm not going to say that you won't find a natural explanation. I would never say that because you might. I can't disprove it. Just like I would never say that I know for a fact there's no magic penguins in the center of the earth. They might exist, and the fact that we haven't detected them is because of their magic. They could theoretically exist. Who's to say that they can't? But we have no reason to believe in them until, I provide evidence for you. So I'll give you an example. About a year ago, the election was heating up between a 2016 election in America between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And someone I know who just loves to go around making fallacious arguments and yelling at people. This guy, this is what he said. He said, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton they're bringing the new world order of the Antichrist in. And I was like, whoa, and he explained it. He said, because it's through global warming. Because global warming is how the Antichrist is going to unite the globe because it's global. Okay. And so that will unite everyone and that will bring in a one world government of the Antichrist. And Hillary Clinton's pushing global warming. Okay. And so that was his argument. And my response is not to say Hillary Clinton's not doing that. Here's reasons why she's not doing that. My response is, he has to provide evidence for that. So I just said, well, that's a conspiracy theory. Where's your evidence for that? Do you have any evidence for that at all? In other words, I am under no compulsion to believe in your thing until you provide evidence for your thing. This is how evidence works in terms of science. Like, you just say, all of the evidence we have now leads us to this conclusion. And the thing is, when it comes to the God of the Gaps argument, it's really heavily biased against the supernatural in favor of the natural. And the proof for that is that you could really do that with any any scientific theory. So you could even have maybe some scientists out there, or there's an accepted theory that explains things in terms of the natural, but you don't like it, and you like this other theory that doesn't exist yet. But one day we're going to find this other theory, and it's going to explain everything. Well, there's no reason for anyone to believe in it until you provide evidence for it, and then we'll believe in your theory. So, in other words, like, if we can't explain the phenomenon we observe, the data scientists observe, humanity observes right now, without the supernatural, then that's evidence of the supernatural. Does it prove the existence of the supernatural? No, because we might one day find a natural explanation, a natural theory that explains it. But until we do, the evidence indicates the supernatural. That's just how evidence works. And you could say that with any scientific, the supernatural and natural distinction really is irrelevant. You could say that with, so I could say there's a natural theory that explains X, but one day we'll find a different natural theory that explains X. Okay? The important part for the scientist, as far as, if your job is to be a scientist, is your job is to find natural explanations. So supernatural explanations are kind of like, you want to go for that what if. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're willing to, but as far as pure logical reasoning goes, it's a shifting of the burden of proof for you to say that you haven't found this natural explanation yet, but you will, and we have to disprove that you'll ever find it before we can have evidence of the supernatural. No, the evidence leads to the supernatural until you find evidence for your new thing. Okay? Bertrand Russell, made the point like this. He's an atheist philosopher, and he didn't like how people, argued for the existence of God, or oftentimes they would just believe in God because of faith, and, they just somehow know God exists, and you can't disprove the existence of God, so they're going to believe in God anyway. And he says, no, you have to provide evidence for the existence of God. Just because we can't disprove the existence of God, that doesn't mean that he does therefore exist. Okay? And just because I can't disprove your naturalistic theory, it doesn't mean that it exists or that you'll ever find it. There's no reason for me to believe in it until you find it. That doesn't mean that I have a problem with you going and finding it. That's your job as a scientist. Okay? And it's great that you're motivated to find it. Okay? So the bigger question is really the motivation behind being a scientist. And so that's what I want to talk about. I want to look at three different sort of... Well, I just want to look at monotheism, the belief that there's one God. Polytheism, the belief that there's many gods. And then atheism, the belief that there's no God. Or just the lack of a belief in God, however you like to define it. Okay, because either the definition is fine for what we're going to talk about today. Now, my point I want to make is that monotheism will motivate you to actually do science, to actually find natural explanations for things more heavily than polytheism, and way more heavily than atheism. And my argument would be that atheism is actually destructive to the whole work of science. It destroys science. It's really anti-thought, anti-intellectual, in a dangerous way. So, monotheism motivates science because what you're doing, and this is really goes back to the history of how science was born in the first place. It was born out of people who had monotheistic leanings. Even in the earlier days of science in the Roman Empire, they were monotheistic philosophers who had come to believe in one God. And then the Christians carried this to another level. But the concept is what's called secondary causation. So, if you believe there's one God who's all-powerful and all-knowing, then everything that happens, God, nothing happens unless God allows it. God is in control of everything that happens. And so what that would mean is, how does God control everything? And so the concept of secondary causation, or gave birth to the concept of scientific law, of laws of nature. And the idea was that God, if he is a truly great God, can control everything without interfering ever. In other words, like, if I design a machine and build it I will know everything that will happen because of how I built it. And so if God created the universe or created physical reality from the get-go, he could put every atom in a certain place and make everything in a certain way with a certain momentum this way and a certain momentum that way, that everything with this would eventually bump into that, and that would bump into this, and this would bump into that, and he could predetermine whatever would happen. He would have to be a truly incredible being to do that, but that would be a greater God than a God who has to come in and tweak things every once in a while. And you know, so in other words, the search for scientific law was a search for like God's blueprint of how he designed the universe to work. That there was a simple little, you know, really simple fundamental rules that he put in place, and he was able to predict everything that would happen based on those fundamental rules. And so it was a holy mission of these monks in the Middle Ages called the Scholastic monks, Christian monks, who said, we are finding God's laws. And we don't, in fact, there was a little bit of, we're not comfortable with telling everyone about our findings because this is so holy. This is holy, sacred knowledge to find laws of science because you're looking into the mind of God and how he designed the universe to work. So, from a monotheistic perspective, the more you can explain in terms of natural theories, the greater God must be to have planned all that out. Okay. So, your worship of the one true God will inspire you to punt to the supernatural less, I guess. Now, polytheism really doesn't fit with the scientific enterprise because you've got different gods who don't really agree with one another, and so they try to slip things past one another in polytheism. So things might work one way, but there's other rules, and they change how the world works because they're at odds with each other. You know, so that's kind of where the concept of magic sort of gets going. And then atheism opposes science because of the problem of reductionism. So, to borrow from Dr. John Lennox, Professor John Lennox at I think he's at Oxford, how do you do science? Well, you know, I use this machine, this fancy machine I have. No. I understand you use that machine, but how do you, the scientist, do it? Well, I use my mind. Oh, wait, I mean, I don't believe in the supernatural soul of the mind. I mean, I use my brain. Use my brain. Okay, so a complicated chemical reaction that is the product of blind physical forces at random gives rise to your thoughts. And you trust this thing? It's really a problem when you think about it. Think about it this way. When you tell someone that you love them, you really mean, I'm having a chemical reaction. Hate, love, everything's a chemical reaction. All of your beliefs are just a chemical reaction. The chemicals just react. So in other words, like, there's no free will in that. There's no room for free will in that. There's no space for you to have free choice. Because chemical reactions and physical processes don't make choices. They just do what they do based on their inherent properties. Oxygen will just bond to hydrogen. It doesn't choose like maybe I will, maybe I won't bond to hydrogen. It just does what it does because of what it is. So no matter how complicated that system of chemicals is, if you knew the chemical properties and the mass and velocity of every particle in that system, you could predict everything that it would do. Okay? And so you wouldn't be making choices. You would just be, the chemicals would just be reacting. So you, as the scientist, would not have control over what you think. So you have no control over your own beliefs. It's very important for the scientist to say, I'm going to believe what I observe to be true. I'm going to believe what is true. I'm going to make sure my beliefs are correct. My statements are correct. My actions are correct. My measurements are correct. I want to be accurate. I want to be right. Okay? But if you don't have the ability of free choice, then you don't have the ability of control of your own thoughts, actions, and beliefs. And the chemicals just react. And there's no control element there. And you could propose some theory, well, you know, evolution causes the chemicals in my brain to, most of the time, react to give me true beliefs. But do they? How do you know that they do? So the theory is that, like, you know, over time, animals who had false beliefs about reality would die out, and animals that had true beliefs about reality would pass on their genes to the next species. Because having false beliefs would probably make you make all sorts of mistakes that would make you wind up dead, you know, like if you walk off a mountain because you thought it wasn't there. False belief. But if you saw the big drop off, you had a true belief, then you wouldn't walk off. Okay, so that's the theory that's proposed. Like, evolution would cause us to have accurate beliefs. The problem with that theory is that even the theory of evolution is just an idea, a belief created by the chemicals. So logically speaking, rationally thinking, as far as pure logic goes, you can never affirm the truth of your own thoughts without free choice, without the supernatural. So in other words, in terms of atheism, you know, you can be an atheist and believe in the supernatural soul, but you would be a fairly religious atheist. You know, most atheists don't believe in souls. And, you know, without something supernatural that, you know, that makes you you, if you're purely physical systems can't have free choice. And so, or if you change the concept of what you mean by physical to the point that it can have free choice, then you've altered the definition of physical so much that it's no different from the supernatural. Okay, because physical means that it acts and does what it does based on its inherent properties. If you change it so much that, like, you know, protons and neutrons are, like, you know, making choices, you know, not based on their physical properties, then that's ridiculous. You know, you just moved the boundary back so much to where there's no line between physical and supernatural. So here's the point. As an atheist, you basically need to take, when you go do science, you need to take your atheism, you need to fold it up and say, all right, as I do science, I'm not going to be an atheist while I'm in the science lab. Because as a scientist, I have to believe that I control the accuracy and honesty of my work. That I'm correct. And if you are nothing but a chemical reaction, and your thoughts are nothing but a chemical reaction, then there is no control element there. And to say that evolution gives me correct beliefs most of the time would really just be circular reasoning. How do you know that evolution gives you those beliefs, makes your beliefs correct? The only reason you believe that is because the chemicals reacted to give you belief in evolution, to give you the belief that they gave you the correct beliefs. So how do you know you can trust the chemical reactions to give you correct beliefs? Well, because the chemical reactions told me so. You know, it's no different from, you know, saying that, you know, Joseph Smith is the prophet of Mormonism because Joseph Smith says so. Okay. That's just circular reasoning. I had a Mormon missionary come to my door, and she said, it's a long time ago, she said, you know, Joseph Smith's the prophet, and I was like, well, how do we know he's a prophet? And she said, well, he said that when we pray about it, we'll feel good about it. Fruits of the Spirit, Galatians 5. We'll feel loved. If we feel good about it, then that means that he's a prophet. I was like, he told you how to know he's a prophet. Like, that's ridiculous. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, circular reasoning. You get it. It's no different from saying the Bible's true, the book of Bible says so. So, like, you know, if you say the chemicals give me correct beliefs because the chemicals say so, it's ridiculous. But it's more problematic than saying the Bible's true because the Bible says so, because the Bible is just a belief you hold that may be a pervasive, powerful belief for someone, but the chemical reactions are your thoughts. You can't. You're locked in. You can't escape. Now, the final point I want to make is just that the proof for God's existence, most of the proofs for God's existence, I mean, there's some of them that are scientific in terms of empirical observation, but other ones are in terms of pure logical reasoning, or what's called rationalism. Now, I recently did a video called Empiricism versus Rationalism, so as far as the debate between that, I ask you to look that up. But I just want to make the point in this video that you can throw all the science out the window. Ultimately, we have pure logical reasoning that proves the existence of God. And I've got many videos on my Proof God Exists playlist to point this out. But that observation of the exterior world does not, you know, does not form the grounding of belief. So, as a monotheistic scientist, even, you know, you can be motivated by pure logical rational reasoning to believe in God, and then go do your science with the idea that a great God would have higher and higher and higher levels of naturalistic explanations, of secondary causations, of scientific laws that God put in to explain this thing that we can't explain other than saying God did it. My great God is so great that he could have done it without, supernaturally interfering. He could have planned and created the universe in such a way that there is a natural explanation that's beyond our comprehension right now, but one day we'll find it. And that's cool. So anyway, that's my video on the God of the Gaps thing. And I really hope that I've done multiple videos on this, but I really hope that this is the last one. Thanks. Have a good day. Bye.